My next guest probably needs no introduction, but just in case, Robert Dilts is the creator of Sleight of Mouth. He's been a NLP person since the very beginning. He is, in fact, the author of NLP Volume 1, along with others as well. He is a co-developer of NLP and responsible for so much stuff. It's thrilling to have him here, so let's admit him from the waiting room. Here we go, Robert Dilts. You are listening to the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast, a show devoted to uncovering the systems and the secrets that set the best apart, where you learn how to take your coaching clients to the next level, while you grow the coaching practice of your dreams. So sit back and relax, or sit up and get excited. Either way, you might want to pay attention. This could be important. How are you?
Good, good.
Back home, and where are you? Are you in France or are you in
Well,
where?
this is California. I'm in Santa
California.
Cruz. Yeah, that's the California office. Yeah,
California office. Does this feel like home, or is Paris
they
take?
both they both feel like home. You
Okay.
know, yeah. My wife and I, for a long time, have thought, which one is more home, and they're kind of both. They're she's American, but has lived in France for 40 years. So
Yeah.
so her, she has a lot more roots in some
Right.
ways there.
Yeah.
But
Uh,
we both enjoy it. We both love it. So
yeah. Well, what's not to
yeah.
love? So thank you for being here. Awesome to see you again. How was your travels? You've been all over the place recently, have you not?
Yeah, yeah. I was in. Well, I got back from Tokyo a couple weeks ago, and then was in uh, France before that. But then was going around to Italy and to Holland. So kind of getting back on the road post
On the
COVID.
Yeah, exactly. Live trainings again. What a concept.
Yes,
Was it weird to get
yes.
back into doing live trainings?
Not necessarily. No, it's yeah. It's actually the one that I did in Tokyo was a hybrid. So some people were physically there and some people were on Zoom, which
Oh, I
was
see.
which
I
was
see.
yeah.
Got it.
But no, it's not weird. It's just kind
Like,
of re getting back into
yeah,
the rhythm.
got it. Yeah, I did a live seminar just over the weekend. And it was like, oh yeah, I remember this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
Yeah,
kind of like that feeling. Like, okay, yeah, I got this.
yeah,
And it's yeah. I mean, there's stuff that's in the muscle, let's say.
yeah,
So
yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Good. Well, we are here for a very particular purpose to help
But
raise money for Mary Lou CV and, of course, Jerry, who is the one who
sorry.
should be spending it on, but I don't know who it's really
Yes.
for, if it's for the both of them. But we're here just to do that, and so we can talk about anything at all. You can. I know I read something where were playing. You played guitar back in the day, like when you first
Yeah.
went to Santa Cruz. Do you still play?
A little bit,
Do
but
you have a guitar ready? Are you ready to do a song or two?
no, no,
What-
not that.
you could
No,
just
not
do
that way.
air guitar if you want, air
A
guitar
guitar.
or air ukulele or whatever, air violin.
No, my piano is much more brushed up than my guitar, but I don't have a piano. I can
Oh.
try to play. No, I think we could probably do something much more interesting than listen to my guitar.
Well, it depends on your definition of interesting. But sure, we can talk about stuff. Tell me
Yeah,
about.
well, I know you had David and Judy and
Well, I haven't had
uh,
Judy yet. I haven't heard back from her
we
at
haven't
all.
had Judy.
So if you can put in a word for me, appreciate that.
Okay, do you have a way of getting in touch with her? Have
I
you?
just have an old email address that, if it works, she ignored me. Let's put it that way.
Uh-huh.
So
Well, it might not be. I believe the one that works now is Jan.
Don't say it. Don't say it. Don't say it. You can tell me privately.
Okay. All right.
We don't necessarily want to put that out into
Okay.
I mean,
I'll tell you.
if it's okay to, go ahead, but I'm just saying, up to you.
Okay. No, we can. I'll put it in the chat, actually.
Okay, that'd be good. And if you have another way of getting hold of Chris Halbum and Tim Halbum, I've been trying to get hold of them.
Why don't I? Then I'll just send you all their emails.
Good. So we can get. But meanwhile, let's talk about NLP and about juicy things that maybe nobody's ever heard of before.
Okay.
I've heard some really good stories. You've told some really good stories over a few beers here and there. About the early days of NLP. What about this Richard Bandler fella? Do you got any good Richard stories?
Oh, I mean, there's plenty of good Richard stories.
I remember you told a story once about being in a bar with him, and he
yes.
got in some kind of fight or something.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was more the interesting thing about that was that the kind of it was not so much about Richard per se. But we oftentimes when we would have meetings, he liked to meet in unusual places, and so like this was this biker bar, and I would be very out of place in a biker bar. And anyway, Richard was to my right, and we started talking, and these two guys came out, and like big guys, and started calling us homosexuals and queers, and to get out of there. And of course, at the beginning it was just trying to ignore them, and they got kind of louder, and it was bumping my arm, and so got turned, smiled to them, and they're like, don't look at me, don't smile at me, you blah 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 blah. The kind of this thing of if you look at me while I'm talking to you, don't look at me, da 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 da. And so finally, I was kind of just sort of that was, and actually that was kind of interesting, my own response, because in the beginning, I was kind of was noticing this kind of feeling of you talking to me.
Oh yeah.
Finally, I don't think that's going to end up well. But anyway, so I kind of just finally got back into sort of my coach state, if you will, my more resourceful state. And I kind of took a soft focus, so it wouldn't be like a you say anything provocative, but I said, hey, look, look, I'm wearing a wedding ring, I don't really think that you think I'm a homosexual. I think that you have some other intention, like, so I was like going for the positive intention. And of course,
so you asked this biker guy, what is your positive intention for this?
Yeah, I said, I think you have a different intention, So one of the guys who was kind of the brains of the bunch said, yeah, we want to fight. I was saying, yeah, well, I get that, but it's not going to be very much of a fight, because there's two of you, there's one of me. I don't want to fight, so it's it's not going to be very much of a fight. And then when the other guy goes, well, it'll be a fair fight, we're drunk. And I was like, right. Actually, I had a little bit of, in some ways, kind of started to get some empathy for these guys. And I said, well, get that, but wouldn't that be kind of like, a father coming home and beating getting drunk and beating the heck out of his kid and saying it's fair because he's drunk, because I knew probably both of those guys had their fathers probably did that. And it was kind of interesting because they didn't know where to go with that,
Yeah. So little metaphor pattern from Sleight of Mouth, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a Sleight of Mouth. And anyway, according to Richard, then I was eliciting their submodalities for how they get me or something. But I wasn't really and actually they kind of didn't really know what to do. And then someone else came in, and according to Richard, he suggested that if they wanted to fight, they should go out and fight each other. So, but I don't remember.
We'll referee.
What I do remember, somebody else kind of came up and they started hassling this other person. And I think he took them outside and did beat them both up somehow. But anyway, it was interesting, that kind of, it's, when you, for me, is that realization that people that are doing that are probably very wounded people, and so to have some kind of compassion for their wound is actually, it's more like the Aikido aspect, if you see what I mean, rather than rather than just be, whatever, angry about it or upset about it. It's like, oh, these guys would be great actually if they could get some, some kind of support. NLP would probably be really useful for them.
Yeah, for sure. But that is a really interesting point of view, though, because I have found in my own use of NLP and Sleight of Mouth over the years that if I'm in a situation where somebody's like being I was about to say being a dick, but I shouldn't say that out loud, but being
Being a pain in the
yeah, being provocative in that way, and triggering me in a way that I respond like I used to maybe in high school or something, that I don't necessarily get access to my best stuff. That's just that way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the sort of the whole state dependent aspect, and the quote, quote coach state versus crash state,
Right.
We like to say, when you're in a resourceful state, coach, which is the acronym for centered, open, alert, connected, and able to hold what's happening, then you are in your connection with your resources. Then what you think is magic, what you say is magic, what you do is magic. When you're in a crash state, which is the contracted, reactive, analysis paralysis, separated and hostile, then what you think makes no difference, what you say makes no difference, what you do makes no difference. I mean, so every NLP technique, works when you're in a resourceful state. None of them work when you're in, or not none of them, but fewer and fewer work as you go more and more into this kind of crash state. And so I think that's the key, as you were saying, that if you are being confronted, always the first thing is, okay, before I start doing any technique, I've got to first get into get my filters, if you will, into a generative state or into a resourceful state. Yeah, I think that's the message. And I'm thinking about for what Jerry's going through, that being able to kind of get into a healing state is going to be really really important, and to kind of have practices that allow us to kind of allow you to stay in that state.
Yeah, for sure. And interestingly, I talked to Marilyn about her response. She was on my podcast recently, Marilyn's Mary Lou CV, and she was describing how NLP really kind of saved them both, saved her because she was able to get into that state and therefore save him in a way, because they had just sort of set him up in a waiting room at the intensive care, or at the emergency room. He looked okay. So they said, okay, just sit him over there. It's just an old man, just sit him over there. And so she got on the phone and just like got in a good state and said, that man needs to have a CT scan now. And so that's how they got the whole thing going. But she said throughout this whole process, she's really had to rely on NLP and being in that best state in order to be able to access those resources and get him the care that he needs.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's one of the great gifts of NLP, so again, I think it's that notion of state first, before technique, because you could try, again, if you try techniques in in a state that is not conducive to them, they don't work,
Right.
so that, of course, there are techniques that you can use to get into the state, but again, I think it's a kind of a first things first. And I think, kind of going back to our topic of sort of early days of NLP, I think that was always the one of the realizations, and I think it's part of what Erickson brought into the whole mix, the whole notion. I mean, he would call it hypnosis, but you could call it state management,
Hmm.
So what is hypnosis? It's access to a certain kind of a state where you've got a connection to, more than your cognitive mind, if you will. And I
Okay.
think that was always
I,
a,
I'm very, very interested in that. So how was what happened? What was different when Erickson was introduced into the mix? When Gregory Bateson said to Bandler and Grinder, "You got to go, study with this guy." Or meet.
yeah. So I remember, I got involved right before they started going down to see Erickson. So I got involved right when they had written The Structure of Magic. They hadn't been published yet. Then it was published in this. My history is I walked into a linguistics class. I had in my previous, I was a junior at the university, University of California at Santa Cruz. I started there as an art major, and then switched over to physics and calculus. And then my third year, I went into politics. I switched my major to politics and thought, well, I should
Very
learn something about.
logical through line there. I can see
Well, in
that.
a way, in a way. So it was kind of like right brain, left brain, and
Boom, boom, back and
I
forth.
didn't know that research hadn't quite come out yet, but I was finding that out. Well, I started missing my left brain, but then and so I decided, well, I should learn something about linguistics, and because I was interested in politics, and my older brother was also a linguistics, like, he was getting a master's in linguistics at Harvard at that time, was kind of encouraging me to look into it.
Hmm.
So I walked into this beginning linguistics class with 200 other people, and there was, John Grinder was the professor. And remember, like, one of the first things he said, well, if you're taking this class because it's a requirement, come up and see me afterwards, and I'll just sign off for you, because I don't want you in this class if you're not interested. I was kind of going, whoa, that's and of course,
How many people
John,
took him up on that, by the way? I'm just
I don't
curious.
know. I don't. I don't know. I don't know if anyone did, but I thought it was an interesting. It was more that, this
Yeah,
attitude that
I like it.
I'm not interested in, this kind of bureaucratic stuff. I mean, that was a little bit of the
Yeah,
time
sure.
and place.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
but then John also, of course, here's a guy who was a former Green Beret ranked tennis player, stuff like that. And so it was not like your typical college professor at all.
Hmm.
And so, and I remember he taught, I think it was like, I don't know, like the second day of class, started teaching us stuff they were doing in Structure of Magic.
Right.
And it was like, I was going like, whoa, this is the first actually practical stuff I've ever learned in school that I can actually go out and do something with. And, so he essentially taught us most of the meta model patterns. I think it was a Tuesday and Thursday class. That was the Thursday. And by following Tuesday, what I remember is, coming back in, and probably half the class was looking pretty dejected, pretty down, because they'd alienated their, their friends, their parents, by asking him all these questions,
Right.
love me, how specifically? Do this
How
all the
specifically do you want? How specifically do you want to pass the gravy? Yeah.
yeah. So, but I fortunately had I had some natural rapport. Like
Mhm.
I mirrored people from the time I was a kid.
Right.
We have home movies, me like looking around, mirroring my older brother and stuff. So
Uh-huh.
I didn't have that problem. It was actually
Because you used it with rapport skills. You used.
Yeah, and they started, and they discovered, yeah, you have to include rapport pretty quickly. They started teaching that, and also the so-called softening techniques. So instead of just saying, well, how specifically, or according to whom, you say, I'm really curious to know how specifically, or
Okay.
I'm wondering. So
Yeah,
you
yeah.
soften it so it doesn't sound like it's the third degree. But to your question then
Back to my question.
about Erickson and how
Yeah.
that changed. So, obviously in the beginning, it was language, 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 language. And I remember probably about halfway through that class, it's they were on a quarter system. So a couple months or so later, because they had sent the manuscript of Structured Magic to Bateman. And he said, wow, you guys, looks like you're really onto something. You should go down and see this guy, Erickson. So he sent him down there. And I remember when Grinder came back, the class he did after that, basically he said, everything you know is wrong. That it's the opposite of that, because the Milton model was basically violated everything about the meta model. And that's when they started incorporating more and more of the, in fact, of the hypnotic stuff. In fact, the first time I ever saw Bandler, John was doing this class and had Bandler come in, and they were doing this induction on the whole class. And I remember, like, Bandler was in the back of the room, in the back of this big,
Like amphitheater sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, with the, not
Big rake seat.
amphitheater style seating.
Right.
So he was talking at the same time. Grinder was talking in the front of the room, and like putting all these 200 people into trance. So,
Wow.
wow. And in those days, it was kind of like, it was pretty. I mean, every new discovery was, this is going to, this will change the world. It was that kind of attitude. It wasn't just like, oh, here's an interesting little fact. It was, this will change the world, and it was really that feeling of doing something.
So just to push you a little bit more towards the question I tried to ask, at least, is so the coach state thing. Where did going into being sure that you're in your own best coach type state before you do anything else, how did that come from Erickson? Because I think that's what I heard you say.
Always start with a state.
Okay.
You can be, he would move people from state to state. Obviously, you have, Bandler and Grinder started talking about uptime and downtime, right?
Okay.
So you have uptime is, I'm totally in my sensory experience, etc. Downtime is, I'm basically in a trance. It's all the sensory channels are turned inward versus outward. And then you had so-called mixed state, where mixed state would be, I'm kind of partially here. And of course, there was, even in the Erickson work, there's different levels of trance. You can be in a light trance, a medium trance, a deep trance, and each one has this kind of, the filters are in slightly different, different focuses and different statuses. So, and very early on, we were starting to do a lot of the state management stuff. So state management, and John, was really emphasized this notion of a state of excellence. And that's where you also had, like, the circle of excellence was anchoring to be able to get into that state.
Okay. So is that one of the techniques that you would use then to change state before you do? That's a change technique? Yeah?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Circle of excellence.
Nice.
Because anchoring came fairly early on.
Okay. And I think it's also, to me, just kind of interesting. I don't know if I knew, if I did, I forgot that John was a ranked tennis player. That's pretty impressive. You got to be good, obviously, to be able to do that.
Yeah.
But plus, it's I would think, from my own athletic background, that if you're going to be good at something like that, you have to not be in your head. You have to not
Right.
be like thinking and thinking. You have to be in uptime. You've got to have all of your sensory
Yeah.
apparatus ready to go. So I would think he'd be really good at that.
And he was, and he also, that was early '70s, around the same times when Tim Galway did The Inner Game of Tennis.
Yeah, great book.
Yeah, and I think that whole notion that talk, so inner game, outer game, so
Right.
state, action. If you lose the inner game, you're pretty guaranteed to lose the outer game,
Right.
So you got to start with the inner game, and I think there was a lot of influences that sort of brought that about or reinforced that perception that you start with the state, and from there, then you can, if if you're in the again, if you're in the right state, anything works, you know. Uh, so
Yeah. Interesting. Cool.
yeah,
Love it. So, how do you know what the right state is?
well, that's where you have these different, the different qualities, like we were saying, just, the coaches being centered, being open, being alert, being connected,
Hmm.
holding, and obviously the way that you do that is by calibration, and of course the tricky thing that happens with a lot of self calibration is what happens as you start to go into a crash state. The more crash you are, the less you can calibrate, right?
Yeah.
Because you're
Right. Because
so
you're
it's like the person who's totally drunk and is going, no, I'm fine, I can drive home, I'm
yeah, yeah,
perfectly
yeah.
capable. Or somebody who's mad, they're going, uh, don't say I'm mad, I'm not mad. I'm not angry.
I,
So
I have
a
never
lot
said
of
that
times
ever in my life. It's never.
I've never said that.
I don't. I've read about people doing that.
Yes, I read about people
Never.
who've done that. But no, and so I think what then you so of course we would put this kind of states, what we do with the coach and crash, right, is you put it on a calibrating scale of 0 to 10.
Hmm.
And what you realize is if you're kind of 5 or above, you can rely a lot on your own self calibration, right? You can tell, wait a minute, I'm tense here. I can tell my voice is my tone of voice is too high or it's too fast, my tempo is too fast. You start getting below 5, and you're not aware, your self calibration starts going out the window.
Yeah.
So then if you haven't still enough presence of mind, you would tell by having certain kinds of uh, physical things that you can do, that you realize, okay, if I cannot do this, like a simple thing might be, can I balance on one leg? If I can't do that, I'm probably not very centered, let's say, or I'm probably
Hmm.
pretty much out of center. So it's a little bit like what do the police do if they pull somebody over suspected of drunk driving? You have a set of things like touch your nose, do this, do this, do this. So you could have, I mean, what I might do is to have my own little set of actions, which also become self anchors that help to both check the state and then get into it, like a tote, test,
Yeah.
operate, test. So you're doing some kind of thing where you are using, on the one hand, yourself, just inner self-awareness, and on the other hand there can be kinds of activities that can let you know am I ready? Yeah, think of any athlete, um, when they are getting ready for a competition, right? They're going to go through, you'll see them kind of going through these things where they're in
Sure.
their state tote, you might say. I've got
Hmm.
to bring myself into that state. So you might see moving parts of the body. um, when I was coaching my son's baseball team as a coach, and he was his teams were um, state ranked, and I think he was a all county. I think his batting average was 460 or something, which is
Wow.
pretty good.
Pretty good.
But what I would teach him is, okay, when you're standing at the plate, that's where you've got to really get into the state. So I would say, okay, like you take your bat and you're going to touch the four corners of the plate, and you're kind of going, centered, open, alert, connected, ready. Okay, so now I'm not going to lift that bat until I'm in the state where I'm going to be able to, react and properly.
Cool.
So you can have little things like that, I think. So I guess the part of the answer would be, practices,
Mhm.
that become habits, so that you're not trying to have to figure it out. And that, how would I say, that actually these habits themselves are not state dependent, meaning I'm going to do them to get into that state, or they help
Right.
me to get into the state, rather than I have to be in the state in order to remember to do it. That's
Sure.
usually the problem.
Right, right, right.
If I'm not in the state, I forget everything that I should. I forget all about all the stuff that I know.
Yeah, and the point right there really is, in a sense, if I'm going to perform on a concert, it's like I have rituals that I go through before
Yeah,
I play that put me in the state to be able to perform. If a batter is
exactly.
going up to a batter's box, he or she knows they're going to do that.
Yeah,
And then there's a
yeah.
batter's box. It's like stepping into the circle of excellence. You're stepping into your
Well,
sphere
excellent.
of excellence. And then
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
Boom,
But if
boom.
somebody's like being a dick in the bar
Yeah.
and sort of knocks you from behind, and hits your arm and says, "Hey, what are
Yeah.
you?"
Knocking your drink. Yeah. And stuff.
It's like,
Well,
how do you get into a good state there?
yeah. It's actually, that's the whole thing. I often will share the example. One of my favorite examples of state and this notion of inner game is the so-called Miracle on the Hudson with Chesley Sullenberger, right?
Yeah.
So taking off out of what I guess was LaGuardia,
Yeah.
and at what critical point of takeoff, there's a big, what they call a bird strike, unexpected flock of geese flies in front of the plane. So many are pulled into both engines, they're shut down simultaneously. So that's a very interesting moment, right? If you fail in the inner game at that moment, if you crash inside, you're going to crash outside.
Yeah, for sure.
So he was able to stay in that state, keep everybody else in that state, land the plane on the Hudson River, everybody survives, the miracle. And afterwards, they were asking him, wow, you stayed so calm, weren't you afraid? And I thought his answer was great, because he said, "Are you crazy? I've never been more afraid in my life." That's stupid. I'm in an airplane with no engine. I've never been more afraid in my life, and I've never been more calm in my life.
Hmm.
So now you think, well, that's interesting. How is that possible?
Yeah.
And then, and so this is one of the things we say, is that fear does not necessarily mean crash, right? I can be afraid, and you just like I can be. If I'm angry in a crash state, it's going to come out as violence. If I'm angry in a coach state, it's going to come out as maybe determination or
Hmm.
courage.
Hmm.
Similarly, fear. If I'm afraid in a crash state, I'm going to panic. If I'm afraid in a coach state, boom, I go into this, hyper uptime state, like a super state, and then I'm very capable. And so they said, well, how did you stay so calm even though you've never been more afraid in your life? And he gave several answers, because I think this is, and I think this is answer to your question, right? So something unexpected and unpleasant happens, right? That's dangerous. So his first answer was, essentially practice. He said, I've never been in that particular situation before, but I've had a lot of, as a professional, I have a lot of practice,
Hmm.
how to, how to deal with that, how to manage. He didn't use the term manage my state, but that's essentially what he was saying. I remember he used a metaphor. He said something like, I had enough experience in my bank of experience that I could make a big withdrawal that day.
Nice.
But how do you put something in your bank? One of the things I like to say is that experience alone the experience alone is not enough to learn. You have to reflect um, mindfully on your experience in order to stick it in the bank. That's self-modeling. Right. So I think that's one thing. The more that you practice, right, you're getting it in the muscle, we would say. And then and then a second thing he said, which I also thought was interesting, and it relates to the neurological levels. He said, well, also, I was afraid for me, for my life, but I was also the captain. I'm the captain of the plane. I'm the leader. I was calm for 200 other people.
Mm.
So that you know that was it was my mission to keep them safe. And I
Yeah.
think that's that interesting thing is you connect something bigger than yourself.
Yeah.
So it's not just about you. And the third thing he said, actually, he said two other things. Third thing he said was what also helped that the crew was so calm and the passengers were calm. And when they asked the crew, well, why were you calm? They said, well, because the captain was calm and because the passengers stayed calm. And they asked the passengers, why were you calm? Well, the captain sure seemed calm and the crew was calm. So you create this field, a resourceful field where, we have mirror neurons. And so our state feeds other states.
Hmm.
And I think that's another thing to realize that so the dickhead in the bar, right? If your mirror neurons are picking up them, right, you're going to
Yeah.
be going, you talking to me, you talking to me,
Yeah.
because now you've gotten into their field.
For sure.
What I was realizing in that case, I've got to flip that around. I've got to have I've got to influence them with my mirror neurons rather than escalate what was going on with them. So there is a thing that Gilligan and I call a second skin. And a
Okay.
second skin is a kind of it's not an armor. A lot of times when people try to put up an armor or a barrier or whatever, but a skin is interesting because it's selective, but it's also receptive. You know what I mean? I'm not just disconnected. It's like a filter where I can let some things in and some things out. So I kind of practice,
Hmm.
creating this kind of a second skin for those situations. By the way, the other thing that that Sullenberger said, he didn't say it in any of the interviews, but he wrote about it in his book. Yeah, it was interesting because it was about the suicide of his father, which you might think, well, how could that be a resource? And it was probably the most devastating thing in his life. I think his father committed suicide some years before. And he said, well, what I did is, so we could say, like, instead of just going into some crash state, said I made the commitment to myself that I would never be a bystander, that if I could do something to help others, I would do it. And he said, the suicide of my father was very present for me in those moments in the cockpit. And he said, and one of the reasons that I was so committed to saving all those people is because I couldn't save my father.
Mm-hmm.
It's that interesting kind of Aikido where I'm going to turn the wound into a mission. And I find that in a lot of my work, that somebody's mission, especially if it's a true mission, a felt mission, is usually related to a wound somewhere in their life. And that wound becomes healed by transforming it into a mission. And that mission is usually service.
Hmm.
So I transform the personal wound into a service to others.
Is that true for you, Robert Dilts?
Sure, of course. Yeah. And there's big and little wounds. And I think that's something I learned early on. I think, if you look at Erickson,
Yeah. Well.
the healer, right? You've got
Sure.
rather than letting these things bring you down, you're aikidoing them into
Yeah.
a resource.
Nice.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So
one of the things I
hey,
learned originally from Steve Gilligan, I think, is the both and kind of state, being both
right,
part of something and apart from it at the same time.
right.
And I remember I was listening to interview with Jack Lemmon, I think it was. Yeah, it was. It
Oh
was
wow.
Jack Lemmon, who was talking about the difference between the way he approached acting and what some people, the way that some people approached like method acting, where you just
Yes,
kind of
right,
lose yourself completely, you become the character, and so they would
right,
never come out of character because they just became the character, and he said
right,
that's not acting. He said that's I don't know, some sort of form of schizophrenia perhaps, but it's not
right, right,
acting.
like
He said,
psychoanalysis or something.
yeah. So you said to be an actor, you've got to be both be, the part, the character that you're playing, but you also have to be back there as the actor
Right, right,
at the
yeah,
same time. So it's
yeah,
both. And it's he
yeah, yeah,
used the metaphor of the Greek theater. They had the masks that they would
yeah,
stand behind, known as the persona, and they'd have little thing.
right,
So the actor would be behind the mask. So
right,
that's really kind of what it is. You're the actor behind the character.
yeah,
And
yeah,
and I found some for me a lot of times when I'm in a state, not necessarily like the state you described at a bar like that, but with clients that may be getting themselves, into a state that I don't necessarily want to go with them to that state. I can
right,
I can match and mirror perhaps and be in a similar external state, but back here, I am
right,
in my coach state
yeah,
and
right.
able
And
to
I
be
think
both at the
that's,
same time.
yeah, I think that's kind of like the there's a, I think, a bit in there that's similar to the second skin idea, right?
Yeah,
Second skin, it's kind of, okay, so that's the me that's in the world,
yeah,
but I also have me that it's kind of like there's the outer game me and there's the inner game me, if you
yeah, yeah,
will. And so the
yeah.
inner game me is here, and so I can then put what is most effective into that outer game me. I don't have to put everything out there,
Right.
and I don't have to let everything in there. And that sort of, I like to think of it not like I say, not so much as an armor, but maybe it's a bit like Iron Man or something.
Yeah,
It is a it's something that I can control, or or I'm in charge of, but is
yeah,
not
yeah.
directly, you know it's not everything that's there. I can let what needs to be let out, and what is appropriate to let in. So I
Hmm.
can stay present with somebody who's, let's say, in a big crash state, but I don't have to go into that crash state, and
Right, right.
I don't have to disconnect either.
Huh.
So you can have, there's that interesting difference between, what they call it, empathy and compassion.
Mm.
That it's like empathy is it's sympathy, empathy, and compassion. Remember, Brene Brown had this interesting thing about the difference between sympathy and empathy, and then compassion, where sympathy is just kind of, oh, poor you, right? There's no real feeling there. Empathy is, oh, I feel it. And compassion is that dual place.
Hmm.
you know I think
Nice.
that's compassion, I feel with, which doesn't mean I'm
Oh,
picking.
yeah, yeah, good. I like that. That's great. I love it
Yeah,
when language does that sort of thing for us. It's like, oh,
yeah,
that's why that's like that.
yeah. Well, that's interesting too, because we know that we both have a passion for sleight of mouth. And I was thinking about, of course, the whole beginnings of sleight of mouth are related to Richard Bandler, because you were asking about those
Yeah.
Bandlers. I mean,
Tell us that story, please.
well, that was an interesting. So it was an interesting time. It was in the early '80s, and was around the time when uh, Richard and Leslie were sort of separating. So I don't. Richard was not in his most happiest times, let's say. But I remember we were in Washington D.C., and there was, interestingly, there was a guy that he was doing some demo with, who was breaking up from his girlfriend, or wanting to break up from his girlfriend. And I think there was a sort of some kind of resonance there. I mean,
Hmm.
on the
Yeah.
opposite, kind of mirror way. And so first he was trying to kind of convince this guy that he wouldn't have to necessarily leave his girlfriend. But everything he would say, this guy would come back with something, some sleight of mouth, like, well, but why don't if you feel this way, why don't you tell her that that's the way you're, because it was like this thing where he says, I know she doesn't care about me because, um, you know, when I feel this way, you know, she doesn't ever do anything, you know, something like that. And
Yeah.
Bandler said, well, do you tell her that you're feeling that way? Well, no, of course not. What, but why do you, how do you expect her to do something? Well, I mean, if I told her, then she could manipulate me. So, but, and then it's like, found out, well, has there ever been times that she's done that? Well, yes, of course that she's done that. But, well, then what is that? Well, but, you know, I've been keeping score, you know, she's more times this way. So it was like, this whole thing was, you know, yes, but, yes, but, yes, but. And so what happened is that then while Bandler was doing this demo with this guy who kept, you know, sleight of mouthing everything that Bandler tried to do, he was on the stage, and I remember that what happened was the part of the stage, you know, it was like one of the stages that's on legs
Mm-hmm.
in a, like in a hotel, and one of the legs, when Bandler walked to one side, one of the legs buckled, and he kind of almost fell, and some guy came and set it back up again, and then it happened again where the thing fell, and the guy was going to put it back up again, and Bandler started to go into this whole um, you know, enacted, like we were just talking about, paranoid delusion, like, so where he was, you know, here and putting on this paranoid delusion where he's saying, hey, look, this guy's out to get me, obviously you all saw this, you know, because he was kind of playing on what this client had been saying about his girlfriend. See, this guy he wants to hurt me, you saw him, he did it, you know, he did it twice. He was trying to lure me out there, he wants to kill me, you know, you've got to help me. And so he's saying this to the whole audience, you've got to help me. Just like the guy was saying to Bandler, you know, I'm having this problem, my girlfriend, help me. But then everything Bandler tried to do to help him, it would get sleight of mouth.
Mm.
So he started engaging people in the audience. And of course, anything they said, he would start to sleight of mouth. So somebody said, well, you know, ask him his positive intention. Oh, that's easy for you to say, ask him his positive intention. You're sitting over there, he's not out to get you, you know, he's going to hurt me. And someone would say, well, okay, you know, I'll sit over here and next to him and make sure he doesn't get you. You know, it's like, oh yeah, well, if he doesn't get me now, he's going to just even think of worse stuff. You know, oh yeah, that's going to help a lot. You know, wait till, are you going to stay with him the whole day? You know, what's going to happen later? So, you know, he would change frame size or counter example. And I was sitting, and remember, you know, no matter what he would do, you know, he would, and somebody else would, if somebody said something, he started doing this whole thing where he'd say, oh, you know, that person has glasses and he's wearing glasses too, so you're both out to get me. So like, because you're both wearing glasses, and he's building up more and more of this paranoid thing, and more of the audience was against him, you know, as it went on. And finally he's going, you know, can't somebody help me? And person raises their hand and says, well, can I get you some chicken soup? But
So
what happened?
another outcome was
Yeah,
born.
another outcome. But I started realizing, oh wow, you know, I could do what he was doing. You know, there was a pattern. I could start to anticipate and say, oh yeah, I could do the same thing with somebody, so that it wasn't coming from, you know, it's an interesting thing about acting, right? It's not just coming because it's only part of that state. It's like, oh, there's a pattern here that is reproducible.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I started getting the idea for Sleight of Mouth. And then, of course, having read other, you know, the whole idea of people who have changed the world with language, you know, whether it's Gandhi or Martin Luther King or Plato or genius, other Jesus and other people,
Yeah.
and kind of starting to realize, oh yeah, there's these patterns that where language can be really used in this you know, magical way, like you were just saying. Oh yeah, this word versus this word, actually, it's not just semantics. It creates new realizations. It's influencing your map of the world. It's not just it's not just playing games with words. These words are actually making distinctions and things in the map of the world that can create, in some cases, quite profound change.
Yeah. Now, is it true that after those early experiences that Bandler continued doing that sort of test with the audience in other trainings after that? So you saw other examples of.
Yeah, he would do that. He did that. I think he still does it to this day. I mean, but I think for different purposes. I mean, I think, as I was saying, that was kind of when his whole relationship with Leslie was,
Right, right.
you know, collapsing. And after that, I mean, I think that's Bandler just does a lot of sleight of mouth. I mean, that's one of his areas of genius.
Right. And so it's your modeling and sense of him, who perhaps arguably started modeling, invented modeling, perhaps one might posit.
I don't think I invented. I mean, Bandler were modeling. They modeling Erickson and modeling.
Yeah.
I mean,
So you modeled the modelers, is what.
yeah.
Yeah. So
It's kind of meta. Well, there's meta modeling.
meta modeling. How about that? There's another word that makes sense. Wow, cool. And how did you come up with like the icon representation chart, the map?
Oh, yeah. Well, it was like just trying to find a way to represent things. First of all, around the 80s, icons for computers were first coming out, right?
Yeah.
So having an icon that represents a concept was something that was in the field, if you will. And having been, remember I said I started off as an art major and
Yeah.
done different types of graphic design. And I thought, well, what would be a kind of symbolic way of representing the deeper structure of this language pattern? So the icon was also kind of trying to show deeper structure and relationship that you can't not do. That it's like you can do things visually that are not, or I don't know that you can't do them verbally, but they're certainly not as easy to do verbally, which is show in a single image, how things interrelate.
Yeah. I think it's brilliant. I really do, and I often make up reasons why you shaped certain things in a certain way. And I have no idea if that's really why you did it or not, but it makes good sense to me.
Yeah, well, that's the whole thing. That's like poetry, right? It's like whatever sense that you make of it, that's the most important.
But then I tell people this is why it's this way. So,
well, but okay. If I was there, I'd say yes.
Because I'm right.
Because he's right.
That's why you would say that. Absolutely.
Yes.
That's funny, but yeah, and it's also interesting that I have sometimes thought of different sleight of mouth patterns that aren't in your 14, and
yes, sure. I think any type of model is a model, right? It's a map, not a territory, and there's many many things in that territory, and some sleight of mouth patterns clearly overlap as well.
Oh yeah.
So there's, it's not like, I think it's like any map, right? That you're making a demarcation here in the map, that doesn't mean it's in the territory. But just like we were saying about sympathy, empathy, compassion, it's giving you some insight into something. You get another perspective. You get a richer understanding. So I'm sure there's many, and it's like with presuppositions of NLP. I tend to think, there are certain fundamental ones. How would I say? It's a bit like, since I did a major in calculus and physics for a year, you have fundamental premises, and then you have extrapolations from that.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a first distinction, and then that distinction makes other sub-distinctions, which make sub-distinctions.
Yeah.
So, and I see this with some people have like these lists of, I'm exaggerating, but hundreds of NLP presuppositions. Say, well, yeah, actually, you can derive those from this one, so it's like going deep structure, surface
Yeah.
structure.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
you could do the same thing with sleight of mouth patterns, right? That there's different sort of levels of derivations of language where you can play with different words, because words themselves are not all on the same level, right?
Right.
Um, saying green and saying compassion, you're not you're talking
Yeah,
about
yeah,
two different parts of experience.
for sure.
So I think
Tell me about something that I teach in Sleight of Mouth that I didn't actually not learn from you. Um, but I teach it anyway because
okay.
I'm right.
Okay,
Because I'm
we got
right
that.
once again. And that is basically the agreement frame. I don't know if you know even what I mean by that, but I agree with you, it's a yes and a yes. I appreciate, I respect, and so that's the a keto approach. Yes and this way.
Which is different than yes, but
Right, exactly. So how
I like
how right am I that that's important? Just
well, I think because it's pacing and leading, right? I mean, I think all sleight of mouth needs to be done, and that's the Aikido, right? Aikido aspect. I've got to pace and then lead.
right.
If as soon as you start trying to just lead, you're going to get pushback, or
Right.
you're going to get some kind of resistance. So, and I think it's framing. So one of my introductions, I'm actually just designing a sleight of mouth training that I'm doing in February, and one of the things I use to introduce it is how a single word can sort of shift your whole perspective. So I'll say something like, it's sunny today, but it's going to rain tomorrow. And so what happens when you use but, the rain tomorrow is the thing that comes into the foreground.
Mm-hmm.
If you say it's sunny today and it's going to rain tomorrow, now neither is foregrounded, right? You kind of have both. And if you say, well, it's sunny today, even though it's going to rain tomorrow, well, then the sunny is going to probably stay in the foreground. So you can say the difference between but and even though, it's going to shift how you're holding these two experiences. And I think that's what I'm getting with what you're calling an agreement frame, is that, or agreement, I mean, it's a frame. It's how you got to hold what you're doing. And it's the way of, how do I say, it's the frame around what you're doing with the sleight of mouth.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't have that frame and you're just sleight of mouthing, well, then it's kind of like meta model. You could meta model forever. That's why, Bandler and Grinder started coming up with the outcome frame. So you're not just meta modeling. I'm not just asking 1,000 questions. I'm trying to get towards an outcome frame. I'm trying to get towards some kind of a result. So I think these frames are really important in terms of being able to do anything skillfully,
Yeah.
to use it properly. I think if you're in a disagreement frame with somebody, basically sleight of mouth is fodder for fighting and
Yeah.
divisiveness, which is how it's used in politics for the most part.
Yeah, but yeah, but
Yeah, but
yeah, no, I agree, and it's
you agree, and
I do. Gosh darn it, I'm right, and I'm glad you agree with me. This has been the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure seeing you again. Hope to see you again real soon. Come back next week when we have another gripping and exciting episode of the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast. And if you want to, you can find out more about us, each and every one of us, at essentialcoachingskills.com. Thanks.